yourself through the internet. I want to present a review. Gracias. So you could read your slides. Sometimes it doesn't have that.
Ready?
Okay, we're going to go over what's essentially, actually probably for most of you, a really boring topic. However, for the fellows, exceptionally high yield on your MFM board. So I'm going to admit I am not an expert in this theory, so please bear with me. I have not studied sheep for a long time and completely understand gas exchange. We're going to go over placental respiratory gas exchange and fetal oxygenation. The key thing to remember is most of the data we have is based on sheep and or mice models, primarily sheep models. I can't really study in humans, so it has to be extrapolated. Basically, we're going to know how oxygen gets from the atmosphere to the fetus. A lot of the diagrams and everything I got from Tracy, but basically, as you all know, it goes from the atmosphere into the mom's lungs, diffuses across the alveoli, into the mom's bloodstream to the placenta, across the placenta to the fetus, and then to the fetal tissues. Quite a long trip. So to evaluate the uterus uptake of oxygen, you want to measure the difference in oxygen content between maternal arterial blood and uterine venous blood. Oxygen uptake by the gravid uterus is greater than uptake by the fetus because the placenta uses up a large portion of that oxygen. Because remember, the placenta is metabolically active. It is an organ too. And as the fetus grows, so does the oxygen consumption of the fetus, but not proportionately. And a lot of this is studied using sheep animals and the Fick principle. I'm not going to go into depth in it, but you've all probably heard it once in your life. So basically, around mid-gestation, the fetal lamb has a higher oxygen consumption rate per body unit of mass than at near term. If you think about why that is, more stuff is growing, you need the oxygen to help it grow. And also, in postnatal life, the bones and muscle structure are very heavy. These are not the main things that are growing earlier on, it's the internal organs. And they have less weight. So remember, the fetus has a relatively high energy metabolism within the maternal body. It's growing. Even as a neonate, oxygen consumption per unit of body weight at rest is roughly twice that of an adult. If you see all the signs we have sitting around here, for those of you who aren't know beans, a lot of stuff keeps growing in the baby even after it's born. And we grow the most from a young age to as we get older. But you have roughly 300 in a fetus versus 150 millimicromoles per minute per kilogram. And to get an idea, the oxygen consumption in the brain of a newborn is about 12% of that versus 2% in adult. So basically, we're using our brain much more as a neonate than we are right now. And the energy cost of growth represents actually a relatively small fraction of fetal oxidative metabolism. So what is normal fetal oxygenation? In pregnancy, fetal blood has a much lower oxygen saturation and PO2 value than in maternal blood. Remember, all these studies are primarily in land and you're considering at sea level. In general, maternal blood is 96% saturated with oxygen and has a PO2 of about 100. The fetus, however, has an oxygen saturation only about 81% and a PO2 of about 35%. And this is all in studying the umbilical veins. And the fetal vascular tree is such that all organs are perfused by blood having a lower oxygen saturation and PO2 value than the umbilical venous blood. The only exception is the left hepatic lobe. It is perfused almost exclusively by the venous blood. And sometimes, I don't know if you had it in Creos, but there's some reviews that they actually ask you what has the most oxygenation for your MFM written boards. Hope they don't ask me on the oral boards. The exact normal umbilical oxygen of the human fetus is unknown. Again, we're studying teeth. But the blood that perfuses the fetal upper body has a greater oxygen level than the umbilical artery blood. Remember, the main thing that needs to feed is the brain. Think about it that way. This difference is due to preferential streaming, and the oxygen saturation of the fetal ascending aorta is actually 63%. Those are really good for those of you who are visual. I'm much better seeing things than someone explaining to me. So basically, the blood comes in. Most of it, of course, is going to go in the fetus. It's the fetus. And to the left atrium, left ventricle, and up we need to feed the brain. Compared to what's going to go down to the rest of the body, the lungs, and everything else. Interestingly, oxygenation of the third trimester fetus would actually define a state of severe hypoxia postnatally through the adaptive changes. But as I just said, there's a higher oxygen consumption per rate per kilogram versus an adult and a neonate. So how does this work? The fetal heart rate. If you all look at a fetus, very early on, the heart rate's 160, even at term it's 140. So even though the saturation and everything is less, the heartbeat is much, much greater than you'll ever see in an adult or ever really want to see in an adult. Thus, it gets the oxygen where it needs to go. And it's not due to differences in oxygen capacity. Studies in sheep have shown that oxygen capacity in a near-term fetus and a mother are similar. Remember, it's heart rate is key. So looking at the umbilical venous PO2 is a function of uterine venous PO2. So the PO2 of the umbilical vein is less than that of the uterine vein. The umbilical venous PO2 varies as a function of the uterine venous PO2. So it's dependent on it, but it's always going to be less than. Thus, apparently is missing some words. I apologize. The uterine umbilical venous difference remains virtually stable throughout. And it generally stays stable despite changes in maternal PO2, such as deep inspiration and decrease in blood flow. Because increase in intake of air is not going to change the rate of flow in the maternal, in the uterine vessels. And also a lot of times when you decrease flow, a lot of times it has slower flow throughout the uterine vein, more exposure to the umbilical vein, the baby can get more blood. That's the reason one compensates for the other, and they remain stable. If you look at experiments primarily in sheep, each one represents a different animal, triangles, circles, squares. The PO2 was decreased by decreasing uterine artery blood flow, and that the figure demonstrates that it maintains a stable line, kind of what we talked about. So decreasing one or the other, the two mechanisms, the two vessels will equilibrate. So remember, equilibrium of venous concentration of molecules between the mother and fetus. So everything's going to go back and forth, and this is a big thing. This is a diffusion, where diffuse across everything needs to kind of remain stable. And there is a membrane that separates the fetal and maternal bloodstreams. So at the arterial end, you have the mother's blood flow is much higher than the fetal. The PO2 is much higher. And it makes a gradient that's going to drive the molecules across its blood flows. I know we're going very far back for everybody. Probably all wanted to put this behind you in med school and probably even college. However, again, I don't know how your test was, but I had a lot of questions on fetal gas exchange on my written board. I think I had like 5 or 6. So bear with me. I know it's very boring. And trust me, it was fun to review this again. And this is due, and this drives this gradient across. And basically by the venous end, you want to kind of get to a 0% difference. It's never completely 0, but that's what you're working for. Again, another picture. This chapter in Creaky has great ones if you're visual. So basically, you start at this end, the blood flow is both going the same direction for fetus versus maternal, and everything kind of equilibrates at the end. There's a big difference in the PO2 and much less toward the end, and the saturation as you feel becomes different because the mom is giving more to the baby. So what plays a role in this transport equilibrium? Placental oxygen consumption plays a role. Again, we talked about the placenta is metabolically active. And it's actually one of the key things that will keep umbilical venous PO2 at a lower level than the uterine venous PO2. And oxygen enters placenta by diffusion. The key thing they also like to ask in the MFM written exam is how different molecules cross the placenta and diffusion. And you need to maintain a positive PO2 difference between the two in order for oxygen to go over. So what about the equilibrium at the venous end? So there's a difference due to placental utilization does not change from the arterial to the venous end. So as the blood's flowing through, the amount of oxygen used by the placenta will stay stable no matter where you are in the flow. And the mitochondria in the placenta do not really change their oxygen in responses to PO2, oxygen use, in response to PO2 as long as the PO2 is kept above a critical level. So you can have enough oxygen going, but the amount used by the placenta really won't change, or amount taken by the placenta, unless it's a critical deprivation. Therefore, the difference from placental oxygen consumption is a larger fraction of transplacental PO2 difference at the venous end than the arterial end, just because you have less crossing at the venous end. So looking at sheep, around mid-gestation, uterine placental tissue consumes about 4.5 times more oxygen than the fetal lamb. And 70 to 80% of it is by the placental villus tree. And at mid-gestation, the uterine flow is about 5 times greater than the umbilical flow due to size. This excess in uterine flow allows umbilical circulation to get oxygen. And then the placenta approves its ability to transport oxygen from the uterus to the umbilical circulation as the fetus grows. An example in sheep studies has shown that mid-gestation, roughly 18% of the oxygen taken up by the uterus goes to the fetus versus 63% near term. Why is this? And this is key. Because the placental villus tree grows. You increase surface area and you greater capillary volume at term. The main thing that really changes, you go from these intermediate vessels, which have a high resistance, to terminal vessels, which are much thinner and have a much lower resistance. And they think, and babies that are IUGR, and we'll touch on this, and they study some placentas, they don't have as much terminal villi as an intermediate villi, so that's the reason the baby is getting some less oxygen, and that's the reason some of the Doppler changes that we see. Then, what about the regulation of the placental oxygen transport? They've done several studies in sheep making selective changes. They've decreased uterine blood flow. They've decreased umbilical blood flow. They shifted the oxygen dissociation curve. And yes, we are going to go over that. They've decreased fetal oxygen demand. They've given the mother different gas volumes, the different sheep mothers. They've decreased the placental surfaces by making changes. And no matter what, the placental respiratory gas exchange is not controlled by short-term hemostatic mechanisms. So none of these short-term changes made a difference on the hemostatic mechanism. So the placenta is pretty sturdy. You can do a lot of things, and the placenta will still function as best it can until that critical level is reached. So in other words, uterine flow does not change significantly in response, well, I really have some bad spelling mistakes, I apologize, to acute changes in maternal PO2, umbilical flow, or fetal oxygen demand. Thus, the placenta will always kind of get what it needs, but again, remember, sometimes we see difference if the placenta isn't the right size, then it'll affect the fetus, but the placenta will get what it needs. So, there are some other interesting studies they've done. They're actually, in sheep, two different types. There are some sheep that they call hemoglobin A sheep have a much higher affinity for oxygen than these hemoglobin B sheep. And they've seen even in hemoglobin A sheep, where the mom wants the oxygen a bit more, they see a compensation by an increase in its uterine blood flow increased diffusion capacity, and then therefore a lower uterine umbilical PO2 difference, or essentially sheep A's uterine umbilical PO2 difference is the same as sheep B's because its body has adapted to change. What about this evidence in humans? Think about people who live in high altitudes. I know for those of you who know, you talk about how sometimes their babies can be small, but truthfully, I wouldn't say every baby born in Colorado and Denver City, Mile High City is 5 pounds. They adapt to this change. What about hypoxia? This is the main thing that affects what we do. And how does it affect growth restriction? So often, growth restriction of the fetuses have a very low umbilical venous oxygen saturation and PO2 values. Studies evaluating placentas of growth-restricted fetuses and then reviewing their umbilical artery Dopplers have shown those with the worst Dopplers were associated, they talked about, with less term villi and more intermediate villi. And remember, the intermediate villi has a high resistance. Thus, more oxygen exchange was through this intermediate villi, thus poor oxygenation to the fetus. And then, thus, growth-restricted fetuses, generally the placentas are not only small, if you ever send them out, but it's abnormal in its makeup. It's not functioning as it should. Theory being, if you have a small placenta, but it has the proper amount of term villi, the baby's probably going to do better than a baby whose placenta formed inadequately. Again, these changes lead to an enlargement of the uterine umbilical PO2 difference. Might see sheep models where they decrease placental mass. The uterine umbilical venous PO2 difference is inversely related to the weight. Placenta gets smaller. You have normal growth down here, and they have a less gradient, bigger placenta, smaller placenta, more resistance. So studies have also found that hypoxia is associated with very low umbilical flow per kilogram of fetal weight. Why is this? Primarily, this is a theory, but low flow rate increases the chance of equilibrium and thus increasing umbilical venous O2. Basically, the longer it's exposed to the blood, the more it can transfuse across. And primarily, you want the blood to go to the brain, heart, and central nervous system. So, what are the factors that determine uterine venous PO2? The primary influence, remember, the primary influence on oxygen going to the baby is oxygen in the uterine venous PO2. So basically, you have the two main things, the oxygen to saturation curve and everything that affects it, and the oxygen to saturation from mom. So in going over the dissociation curve, you never get away from this. I am sorry. I probably have to review this every single time it's brought up. I have a mental block against it. But remember, the two things that are affected are going to be pH. It's a huge factor. 2,3-DPG, if you all remember, that's a key factor affecting this because it affects the affinity and temperature. Mom has a fever, mom's hypothermic. You're going to shift to the right as pH decreases, 2,3-DPG increases, and temperature increases. Remember, PO2 is inversely related to pH. Thus, maternal alkalosis will lead to a decrease in PO2 in the uterine venous blood, and thus can be detrimental to fetal oxygen. I think this is the Bohr effect. That's a wonderful thing. So what are, again, those factors that affect the oxygen saturation of the venous blood? This can be calculated if you know the saturation of mom's blood, the oxygen capacity of mom's blood, the uterine flow, and the oxygen consumption of the gravid uterus. So keeping that in mind, you can realize how the main types of hypoxia can affect the fetus. If you have a low maternal saturation, you can have hypoxia in the fetus. If you have reduced oxygen capacity, mom's lots of blood, anemic hypoxia, or reduced flow for other complications, you can have circulatory hypoxia, and these will all affect the baby. Oxygenation to the baby. What is the fetus's response to acute hypoxia? Most events we're going to see emerging are going to be acute hypoxia forms. Essentially, acute events will not really affect the cardiac output or placental blood flow. However, you will see an increased flow, so shifting of flow to the CNS and the brain. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to write part. I thought I read this last night. I apologize, everyone. I'm doing my casebook right now, so I'm a little discombobulated. So the main thing, again, CNS and the brain. So thus, acute hypoxia is a redistribution of flow. And you can kind of see in this picture right here, as the blood flow increases to the CNS, okay, heart and brain, as you decrease the arterial O2 consent. So cardiac output to the CNS and the heart must be kept at near constant levels. Thus, the circulatory defense system, however, the circulatory defense system is limited. There's only so much redistribution the baby can do because the perfusion rate is limited. So, but there is a very broad range. Remember, first you have some decrease in oxygenation, and you're going to slowly get less flow to other non-essential areas. How much does the baby need at skeletal muscles? How much does the baby need to get blood to the gut? It's not really using it. And that's just when you're going to start seeing changes when you're doing your biophysical profile and everything else. So if this happens, can't we just give the mom oxygen to help the baby? Because you give a patient oxygen, you increase their oxygen. However, this only causes small changes in the fetal PO2. Two reasons: the dissociation curve and the equilibrium model that we talked about. So there's this great picture, and we'll go over it step by step. So remember, mom is down here, baby's over here. So you give your patient 100% oxygen. You're going to increase her arterial PO2. So you're going to increase it probably from about 100 to 500. She's insane, right? However, if you look at this curve, it's only going to increase her arterial oxygen content roughly by 1. So despite you shifted, remember all the way up there's a leveling off. So at that point then, you realize increasing our PO2 and oxygen content have really no effect on uterine flow. So you do this, you're not going to make the blood flow factor that's getting exposed to the baby. So, assuming everything's stable and there's no change in oxygen consumption rate from the artery to the uterine vein, the venous oxygen content will also rise by the same amount, roughly, by 1. This then increases the oxygen content of the uterine venous CO2 by roughly 11.5 on this area of the curve. And then this then, because of the equilibrium model, will lead to a similar increase in umbilical venous CO2, or point E. So moving along, this will lead to an increase in umbilical venous oxygen content, but given where we are in this curve over here, it gives it a magnitude much less than the mom. So whereas we see a change in the mom of about we only see about a 0.7 in the fetus. And again, assuming everything's stable, baby's functioning well, has no complications, the oxygen content of the umbilical artery will increase by the same amount. Thus, though we made a huge change in the mom from an oxygen over here from 99 to about 500, we're only going to see a change of about 4 in the fetus because of this equilibrium, diffusion, and where everything is on this curve. So giving the mom tons of oxygen does make a change in the baby, but very minimal compared to what you're doing in the mother. So again, a large change in the PO2 of maternal blood results in a minimal change in the PO2 of the umbilical artery blood, or from 410 to 4 in this example. So basically, why are we giving our patients oxygen? Baby decels and we give mom oxygen, right? Why? Genes are different in a hypoxic fetus. Remember, the dissociation curve hypoxic fetus shift curve is completely different than a normal fetus. So in this example, you can see whereas here you made a huge difference in the mom, but also a much bigger difference in the fetus. You went from 4 to 10, so you are giving the fetus that needs the oxygen much more oxygen versus giving a fetus who doesn't need it. You're not really going to do much good. That's the reason we do give moms oxygen. It's not much, but it is something. What about chronic hypoxia? It's kind of interesting. There was a study all the way back in 1992. They had two groups of women, about 15 to 20 in each group, and they gave some women who had growth restricted fetuses 55% oxygen for several days, for a little bit during the day. It wasn't all day long. They did let them off because large amounts of oxygen is toxic, remember? And they found a difference in the umbilical venous PO2 and oxygen saturation when they studied the umbilical artery blood after delivery, and as well as improved Doppler flow in the growth restricted fetuses and mothers who were exposed to oxygen. So, but again, remember, you can't do this for a very long period of time. You can't keep anyone on 100% oxygen for more than a few hours at a time. It's toxic. Lastly, we'll touch base on CO2 transfer. Remember, CO2 is the end product of fetal metabolism, and it's transfused across the placenta by diffusion. Thus, the PCO2 of the fetal blood must always be higher than that of the mom's blood. This is a key to keep in mind because mom is not getting its CO2 off. Baby can't give its CO2 to mom. Baby's stuck with it. Thus, abnormally low fetal PCO2, respiratory alkalosis when it's born, primarily most of the time is secondary to maternal PCO2, high maternal PCO2. I'm sorry. Mom has too much. Mom's asthmatic. She's not blowing it off. Baby can't give it to mom. This baby is going to have respiratory alkalosis at the time of delivery when you see it. Normally not going to be a fetal complication. Whereas high fetal PCO2 or respiratory acidosis seen in the baby can be due to maternal arterial PCO2 inadequacies, inadequate gas exchange, placenta, or combination. So again, if baby is alkalotic, it's generally a mom's problem. If baby is acid respiratory only, it's acute, it can mean multiple things. So to go over some questions, because we went over a lot of stuff, which of the following is true? The umbilical vein has a lower PO2 than the uterine vein. The umbilical vein has a lower pH than the umbilical vein, or the uterine vein. Wow, sorry everybody. Or the umbilical vein has a higher PCO2 than the umbilical artery. Huh? Oh, two. So remember, the umbilical vein has a higher pH than the umbilical artery. Because remember, the umbilical artery has the lowest pH. I did write this right. Okay. And the higher PCO2 is actually lower because the umbilical artery is what primarily is exchanging all that PCO2 over. Which has the highest oxygen content? The spiral artery, the intervillous space, the umbilical artery, or umbilical vein? Think about where gas is exchanged. Where is gas exchanged in the baby? Does the baby do gas exchange with mom in the intervillous space? Spiral artery, umbilical artery, umbilical vein? Huh? It does it in the spiral artery. Because we're asking what's the highest oxygen content. So it's going to exchange in the space. Remember, mom and the spiral artery is going to have the highest oxygen content. It's going to go to the space and then transfuse across. So spiral artery, mom has higher oxygen content than any part of the placenta or baby. Okay. Which of the following is most likely to affect fetal oxygenation. The pH, the 2,3 DPG, maternal acidosis, or changes in fetal hemoglobin. Told you, it's a very boring lecture, and it's going to get a lot. Okay, but these are actual, like, quote-unquote, like, a few questions that people remember getting. It's going to be your DPG. Because you remember, that affects the affinity. If you change it and it's time, mom's not going to give it, mom's not going to give it up. Redundant and maternal acidosis are the same, but acidosis actually improves offloading from the mom. And the maternal fetal hemoglobin affects the partial pressure, not the oxygenation. Okay, this goes back to the picture, and I think I had like two kind of questions on percentages on mine, but which of the following has the highest fetal oxygen saturation? Is it going to be your aorta, pulmonary artery, and I'm talking about, descending aorta, pulmonary arteries, carotid, or your ductal arch? So where's blood going first it comes in, we think about it. Think about it this way. Blood goes into the fetus, goes to the umbilical vein, the vein, then crosses into the heart, and then it's going to go up the aorta and up to the carotid and the brain. So everything's going to basically go into the left, up to the brain, and then everything else can kind of go. So, or you think about this wonderful picture again, if you like pictures. 7 to 16, if you see up here, this starts to go down, and the descending aorta right after there, everything decreased in its oxygen content. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for not falling asleep and dealing with the fact that I probably slept 10 hours in 2 days, so I apologize if I talked really fast. So. Yeah. I'm not an expert, okay? Close fetal what? Oxygenation? So as long as the mom, if you remember, but as long as the mom's oxygenation saturation, like that's the main thing you're looking at. So you're thinking with the high oxygen the high tobacco use, that she's not getting as much oxygen in. But then you have to think then by the equilibrium, then perhaps the uterus will adjust by changing its flow rate. Same kind of thing as the hemoglobin A sheet. For the hemoglobin A sheet, because they have higher oxygen saturation, the more affinity on the hemoglobin A, it decreased its blood flow. So you would think the same kind of mechanism, right? Because most babies that we deliver of heavy cigarette smokers aren't hypoxic by any means. So most likely there's a slow rate of flow compared to a non-smoker in the uterine venous system, thus increased chance of oxygenation transfusion across to the baby, would be my guess. I don't know, but I'm guessing when they, decreased, made some changes in sheet, they probably did study it. I didn't get that exact study. You would think if the fetus is trying to adapt, it would increase, but I think when we look at, I don't know about you guys, but when I think about some of the placentas really aren't that great. You look at they tend to get, to adapt to it. That would be my guess. But we don't always have. that would be like the DPP or the increased affinity. There is, I remember when I was studying, and I can't remember now, there is a dissociation curve of fetuses and moms when moms smoke compared to non-moms. I forget where I found it. I can try to find it again, and it kind of has a lot of the stuff, thank you, that you're talking about, like with the affinity and the carbon monoxide and everything.
And so the other part of it is the effect of using it's not just what's happening with the oxygen and the association force, it's also the effect of the water. So there's a huge range of results.
I'm sure there's studies going on that look at carbon monoxide.
They've done similar changes in sheep, but I don't. When I was at UCLA, one of the guys was a huge sheep guy, so we heard about sheep all the time. Oh, that could be our next study. Anyone looking for a study? No, because it was down at Harbor, which was so, and I'm not really into. Oh yeah, every single thing we talked about was after sheep. I'm impressed because he explains some of them. They're not easy. That's how we found out. Uh-huh. I think that's really interesting. Sorry, I was interrupting him, and I apologize. But the reason we know steroids work for fetal immaturity is because they were trying to use them for another reason, sheep, and then, oh, behold, look at this. And now we have one of the greatest things that we use all the time here, by accident. And that might go back to the heavy tobacco use and why, some of them seem to do okay if you said they grow, they adapt to things, simple set of changes versus big on changes. I don't remember specific. Did you have specific? I don't remember specific exact number. So there was a couple of different ways they asked about the dissociation curve. It wasn't, it was something with carbon monoxide, because I remember now, so I had to look it up after the use of the smoking, and then, different things that affected. But they were being more of like, your mother has a fever, blah, 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 this whole big thing, and then which of the following is going to be affected kind of thing, not straight out questions. But. And then the oxygenation blood flow thing, I was like, are you kidding me? They love to ask fetal circulation questions. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.